I've got 9:30, so I guess I'll get started. Hi, everyone. So this is the presentation that we're all at. And I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you very much for coming. It's an early start to the day. So I appreciate everyone being here. I'm Mark James, and I'm an associate professor of applied linguistics at Arizona State University. And just as I get started, I wanted to point out that I don't have a handout for the presentation, but I will, after the convention, I will post a recording and these PowerPoint slides on that website. So if you're interested in listening again and having a look at the slides, please feel free to visit there. And if you have any questions that we don't answer during this session, please feel free to email me anytime with questions. I'm happy to talk about this stuff, so please feel free. Okay. Okay, and I'll be talking for about 30 minutes. We've got a 45-minute slot. I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for some questions. So as you can see, this is the summary from the conference booklet. And as you can see from the summary, we'll be looking this morning at a practical framework for evaluating TESOL materials. So I'll begin by providing a little bit of background to explain why it's worth evaluating materials from a learning transfer perspective. I'm going to make some connections to Dr. Larson-Freeman's talk as well. There were some interesting things that she said there. I'll talk about that in a minute. Things that will relate directly to what we're talking about today. And then I'll describe the evaluation framework, and we'll walk through an example of the framework being used to compare and contrast to current textbooks. And then we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. Can you guys hear me okay at the back? Is it loud enough? Okay. So first of all, why evaluate materials from a learning transfer perspective? Well, first, we don't have to look any farther than the publisher's exhibit hall here at the convention to get a sense of the pervasiveness of materials in TESOL. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, including those created by teachers for their own classes, to those created by large publishers for widespread use, and from those that are in more traditional forms, like hard copy textbooks, to those that are in newer electronic forms. The examples of materials that we will be taking a close look at in a few minutes are commercial textbooks, which are a very common form of TESOL materials. In fact, well-known TESOL specialist Jack Richards said a little more than 10 years ago that textbooks are the most common form of language teaching materials. And this is reflected in the idea that textbooks are an almost universal element of ELT, English language teaching. And besides being common, textbooks are also influential. For example, being perceived by many to be the route map of any English language teaching program. That's certainly been reflected in my own experience in a variety of TESOL contexts. And I think that this influence of materials, of textbooks, is magnified in some situations. For example, a textbook might be leaned on particularly heavily by teachers who are extra busy and so have limited time for planning, or by teachers who are new to the field, so have relatively limited experience. And a textbook might also be leaned on quite heavily by students who are expected to do at least some work with the textbook independently, for homework, for example. So all of this is just to say that materials in general, and textbooks specifically, are important in TESOL. And with that in mind, it's worthwhile for us as ESOL educators to be able to evaluate materials. For example, we may be involved with choosing new textbooks for our schools or courses. So we need to weigh the strengths and weaknesses of a few candidate replacements. Or with books that have already been chosen for our courses, we may want to look for any gaps that need to be filled with supplementary materials. Now, there are already a number of frameworks that ESOL educators can use to evaluate materials, and they focus on all sorts of things, like how easy the materials are to navigate, how well the materials will attract students' attention, how well they will motivate students and lower students' anxiety, and whether the materials will promote student interaction. And these are all very important, but one factor that doesn't feature prominently in any of the existing materials evaluation frameworks is how well the materials will promote learning transfer. That's what we're focusing on here today, so let's take a closer look at what that means. Learning transfer is the process by which something learned in one context has helped in another, and it's arguably the main goal of TESOL. If students don't transfer learning from an ESOL classroom to other contexts, TESOL has limited value. By extension, then, if TESOL materials don't help promote transfer, they too have limited value. And this is something that came up in Dr. Larson-Freeman's talk, the fourth question. For those of you who saw it, the fourth question that she raised was, if my students are learning something in the classroom, why can't they always apply it when they leave the classroom? And then she talked about this being linked to something called the inert knowledge problem, going way back to some scholarly work in the 1920s. And she talked about then the importance of adaptation, helping our students to be able to adapt what they learn in our classes when they leave the classroom. That's what we're talking about here. She didn't use the label transfer, but a few different labels are used for this issue. And she actually wrote an interesting overview of this topic of learning transfer, and it was published in the Language Learning Journal last year in 2013. So anyway, there's some interesting connections to be made here. Here's the problem. Although we as educators may expect and perhaps assume that learning in the classroom will lead to transfer outside the classroom, over a century's worth of research shows that learning doesn't inevitably lead to transfer, and that transfer can in fact be difficult to promote. But it is possible for TESOL materials to be designed in a way that can help promote transfer. That's because a collection of teaching for transfer techniques has been recommended for use by teachers in education in general and in TESOL. And these techniques could also be used as a basis for designing instructional materials. So with that in mind, I've been developing a materials evaluation framework that can be used to see how well materials, like textbooks, reflect teaching for transfer techniques. And we'll take a look at that. Look now at what that framework looks like and how it works with some example textbooks. So here's an overview of the framework. There are two main questions. The first one asks, does the textbook make connections to situations where students can apply what they have learned? And the second asks, does the textbook get students to make conscious abstractions and seek applications of learning? These questions are based on the idea that teaching can promote transfer by doing two main things. The first is by making learning situations similar to situations where we hope transfer will occur. That's because one factor that we know influences transfer is similarity between situations. And teaching that helps create these kinds of similarities has been called hugging. And the second way that we know transfer will occur is by helping students to learn at an abstract level. So we know that transfer, besides the result of similarities, we know that transfer also occurs as a result of pushing learning beyond concrete facts and routines to more general, higher-level concepts. And teaching that helps promote this kind of learning has been called bridging. So these are the two main questions in the evaluation framework. Each of these has 5 sub-questions. I'll show you those now. So the framework has a total of 10 specific questions. So here are the 5 sub-questions for the first main question about hugging. And they ask, so more specifically, how, if at all, does the textbook tell students that learning can be applied outside ESOL classrooms? And a label that's used to describe that is setting expectations, as a short form. The second one, how, if at all, does the textbook get students to work with, and when I say work with, I mean read and listen to or produce, English texts that occur outside ESOL classrooms? A label we can use there is matching. Third one, how, if at all, does the textbook get students to use English while pretending to be in situations outside ESOL classrooms? Label there, simulating. Fourth one, how, if at all, does the textbook demonstrate the use of English? This is modeling. And the last one, how, if at all, does the textbook get students to use English to solve problems that occur outside ESOL classrooms? And we call that problem-based learning. So that's the first half of the framework. And here's the second half, again with the second main question at the top, and then the specific sub-questions that help us to answer that main question. The sub-questions are, and this is all about, does the textbook get students to make conscious abstractions and seek applications of learning? More specifically, how does the textbook get students to look for situations where learning can be applied outside ESOL classrooms? We can call that anticipating applications. The second one, how does the textbook get students to look for general rules, principles, or patterns behind English use? And we can call that generalizing concepts. The third one, how does the textbook get students to look for similarities between English use and something else they know? And this is using analogies. The fourth one, how does the textbook get students to use English to solve multiple problems that are superficially different but structurally similar? And this is parallel problem solving. And the last one, how does the textbook get students to plan, monitor, and reflect on their use of English? And this is metacognitive reflection. And that's it. So those are the 10 questions. And the idea is that by asking these questions about a textbook, we'll be able to see beneath the surface to the underlying structure in terms of how the book reflects teaching for transfer techniques. And what exactly is it that we might hope to see when we evaluate a textbook in this way? Learning transfer experts, Perkins and Salomon, who are on the reference list that you'll see later, said that teaching for transfer techniques, reflected in these questions, likely look familiar in many education contexts. We see a lot of this stuff already happening in a lot of education contexts, and we can see it in materials too. But they pointed out also that education contexts need to be saturated with attention to transfer. It's not enough to just be using these in a sporadic kind of a way. It's not enough to use them inconsistently. So using that logic, we would hope to see in TESOL materials like textbooks, we would hope to see as much reflection of these teaching for transfer techniques as possible, so that the book is saturated with attention to transfer. So let's see the framework in use. I'll demonstrate that now. I'll walk us through an application of the framework to 2 textbooks. I figure this is a situation that teachers often find themselves in, trying to differentiate between 2 books, for example, when selecting a new textbook for a course. For practical reasons, we'll look at just 1 unit from each book. It's a detailed framework with those 10 questions, so it would be time-consuming for a teacher to use it to analyze an entire textbook at one time. So a teacher could instead analyze a sample like this, 1 or 2 or 3 units, to get an idea of how teaching for transfer techniques might be reflected throughout the book. The 2 books that I've used and we'll walk through are Four Corners, Student Book 2, written by Jack Richards and David Bolke, published by Cambridge University Press, and Network, Student Book 2, written by Tom Hutchinson and Kristen Sherman, published by Oxford University Press. I'm not connected to these books in any other way, just other than that I'm interested in them, as I am in all materials like this. We could use any of a large number of books for this demonstration, and I chose these 2 just because they are current. They're both available in the publisher's current catalogs. They are accessible because sample units can be examined on the publisher's websites. They are relevant across a lot of contexts because they are aimed at a global audience. And they are aimed at adult learners at a low intermediate level, which is a context that I'm familiar with as a teacher. So let's start with the first technique, setting expectations. And the specific question that the framework asks is, how, if at all, does the textbook tell students that learning can be applied outside ESOL classrooms? There was no explicit mention of transfer in either of the 2 units that I looked at. But both of the units pointed implicitly to concrete contexts where English being learned could be encountered outside the classroom. In Four Corners, one activity asks students to read and listen to a conversation, and there are photographs next to the text showing that the people who are having the conversation are sitting at computers having a video conference. Another similar activity asks students to read and listen to a conversation, and there's a drawing of the couple who are having the conversation sitting in a kitchen. The other textbook, Network, is quite similar in this sense. students are asked to read and listen to two conversations that have photos of people speaking. One photo shows people talking in a cafeteria, and the other photo shows people talking on telephones. So although the students weren't told that the English they were learning could be encountered in these particular contexts outside ESOL classrooms, these photos might help them to come to this conclusion. The second technique is matching, and the specific question the framework asks is, how, if at all, does the textbook get students to work with, read, listen, and produce, English texts that occur outside ESOL classrooms? What we're talking about here is getting students involved in authentic language use. And both of the units do this in multiple ways. First, in terms of matching for listening and speaking skills, both units require students to participate in conversations, as well as to listen to recordings of conversations. And English conversations are texts that students presumably can listen to and be involved in producing outside ESOL classrooms. The second book, Network, also has an activity that requires students to watch and listen to a TV report. And this too is a kind of English text that students can find outside the classroom. As for reading, these units require students to read a tourist brochure, an email, a magazine article, and obviously they have to be able to read the textbook itself in order to be able to actually proceed through the lesson. And that is another kind of authentic text, right? Working with a textbook. One main difference between the books appears here in terms of writing skills. Network has some activities that involve writing a few words to fill in a blank, or a blank in a sentence, or a cell in a table. But these seem relatively inauthentic compared to the email that students have to write at the end of the Four Corners unit. The third technique is simulating, and the question we're asking here is, how, if at all, does the textbook get students to use English while pretending to be outside ESOL classrooms? So we're looking here for activities in the units that mimic situations in which students may apply learning in the future. It looks like there are 3 activities in these units that fit this category, though each one is a little different. The first one in Four Corners has 3 drawings, and they show the front yard of a house, as if you were sitting inside the house looking out through a window. In each of the drawings, the weather is different, from raining in one, to snowy in the second, to sunny in the third. And students have to work with a partner, pretending that they're sitting inside the house, looking out through the window, and they have to decide together what they would like to do outside. So with this activity, students are pretending to be in a physical location other than the ESOL classroom. The second one, in Four Corners, is a writing activity rather than a conversation activity. And in this one, the students work by themselves, pretending that they want to make summer plans to visit a friend. And they write an email to the friend to make the arrangements. So this one doesn't involve pretending to be in a specific other place, but it does involve pretending to be in a non-classroom situation in general. If we are assuming that students wouldn't be making email arrangements with friends while in class. I'm not sure that's always the case. They may be, but anyway, we're assuming that they are pretending to be in another situation. The third one on this slide is in Network, and in this activity, students have read an article about a character, and now they have to work in pairs with one partner pretending to be that character and the other partner interviewing him. So again, this one doesn't involve pretending to be in a specific other place, but it does involve pretending to be in a situation involving people who are obviously not in the class. So it seems like a suitable case of simulating, in that it helps students to project beyond the ESOL classroom. The fourth technique is modeling, and the specific question the framework asks is, how, if at all, does the textbook demonstrate the use of English? And we can see here, with the first 2 bullets on both sides, that both of the units include modeling of speaking skills. First, with activities that require students to listen to a recording and then just repeat it. And second, with activities that ask students to have a conversation, but they give them, the unit gives them a written example of what that conversation could look like. For example, in Network, one activity asks students to work in pairs, with one partner thinking of a job and the other partner trying to guess what it is. And it models by providing a sample conversation for the students to read that says, A, do you wear a uniform? B, no, I don't. A, do you work in a ... B, yes, I do. A, are you a ... So it's just like a little script that they can use. And Four Corners has two other kinds of modeling. First, by asking students to listen to recordings of people talking about weather and cities, and then to talk themselves about weather and cities where they live. So this is modeling speaking in a more general way than just asking students to listen and repeat. And second, by asking students to write an email and to use one that's provided in the text in the unit as a model. The fifth technique, which is the last of the hugging techniques that are about trying to make connections to situations outside ESOL classrooms, is problem-based learning. The specific question the framework asks here is, how does the textbook get the students to use English to solve problems that occur outside ESOL classrooms? Now, when I started looking through the units for problem-based learning, I began to see it in all of the activities, right? Even simple ones that involve answering questions about a text or having a conversation, because those kinds of activities involve getting information, and that could be seen as a kind of a problem. So to go into a little bit more depth, I consulted some sources on problem-based learning, and I found one, cited at the bottom here, that focused on problem-based learning in TESOL. And it suggested that in our context, problem-based learning should involve going beyond just gathering information to actually using information to make decisions and judgments. So that sounded useful to me. So with that in mind, we can see a few kinds of problem-based learning in these two units. Both of them have activities that involve students speaking with each other and trying to guess something about the other. Four Corners also has activities that involve students speaking with each other to find out if they have the same opinion, and speaking with each other to come to some kind of agreement. So these are the problematic aspects of the speaking and learning, the speaking and listening that they have to do. Okay, so this is the sixth technique, and this is the first of those that deal with bridging. In other words, with getting students to make conscious abstractions of learning and to seek transfer. So with number 6, the specific question from the framework is, how does the textbook get the students to look for situations where learning can be applied outside ESOL classrooms? The activities that fit best here are both in Four Corners. And they ask students to think about where a listening or reading text is from. The first activity asks students to listen to a recording of people talking and to work out where the speakers are. And the second activity asks students to read an article about a country and to choose from a short list what kind of publication they think the article comes from. For example, is it from a tourist brochure or a vacation blog or a couple of other things? The seventh technique is generalizing concepts. And the question from the framework is, how does the textbook get the students to look for general rules, patterns, or principles behind English use? In the units, it's common for students to be given generalizations. For example, being told a rule behind a particular example of spoken or written language. But asking students to make generalizations themselves, which is what is believed to be best for transfer, is less common. In these units, all three of the activities that required students to generalize concepts deal with vocabulary. And they involve matching words to pictures or to definitions. So this is a case of generalizing concepts because the words themselves are just specific examples of language use. And the pictures and the definitions are the general meaning behind those specific examples. That's why it's generalizing concepts. The eighth technique is using analogies. And the question from the framework is, how does the textbook get the students to look for similarities between English use and something else that they know? I have seen a few activities in other textbooks that reflect this technique. For example, asking students to look at a pair of words like scuba diving and snorkeling and explain what the words have in common. Or reading sentences and writing other ways to say the same thing. So those are examples of what analogizing could be. But in these two units, I didn't find any examples. Number 9 is parallel problem solving, and the question in the framework asks, how does the textbook get the students to use English to solve multiple problems that are superficially different but structurally similar? For this, I went back to the list of activities for Technique 5, problem-based learning, and I looked to see if any of those problems were repeated with different content. And it looks like 2 of those activities are repeated with different content. The ones that involve the students guessing, working in pairs and guessing what each other is thinking, and the other one, the students working together in pairs to make plans with each other. In those units, they have to do that 2 or more times with different content. And number 10, this is the last of the techniques, it's metacognitive reflection. And the specific question in the framework is, how, if at all, does the textbook get the students to plan, monitor, and reflect on their use of English? Both units have several kinds of activities that fit this category. First, activities that explicitly ask students to compare their use of English with a partner. Second, activities that explicitly ask students to check their use of English by listening to or reading a text for a second or third time. And third, self-evaluation statements that students are meant to agree with or disagree with. Like at the bottom of a page, it might say, now I can ask for someone's opinion. And they have to check the box if they agree or disagree that they're able to do that. Four Corners has 2 other activities as well that fit into this category. They ask students to demonstrate. They ask students to demonstrate what they've learned. Both of them. One by asking students to brainstorm, at the end of the unit, asking students to brainstorm a list of words for weather. This is what they've been learning throughout the unit. Now, brainstorm a list of words for weather, see what you can remember. The other one by giving students a list of questions and asking them to check the ones that they think can be used to ask for someone's opinion. And again, that's something they've been working on throughout the lesson. This comes at the end of the lesson. Check the ones you think that you can use. So it's asking students to demonstrate what they have learned in the unit. And that's it. So in summary, this demonstration, the comparison of the 2 units, shows that a range of hugging and bridging techniques is reflected in both of the units that we looked at. And given how common and influential textbooks are in TESOL, I think this is very positive. By having a number of activities that reflect these techniques, textbooks may have increased potential to be a positive force in promoting transfer, a main goal in TESOL, and something that Dr. Larson-Freeman was emphasizing again. But this doesn't mean that these units are saturated with attention to transfer, because more could be done. For example, neither of the units set expectations explicitly or used analogies, and modeling involved only speaking and writing, and generalizing concepts involved only vocabulary. So with this kind of information, though, teachers using either one of these books could help to fill in these gaps. For example, a teacher could tell students where the targeted learning outcomes in these units, which include talking about weather and talking about jobs, where they can be used outside the ESOL classroom. The teacher might tell the students, for example, that you can use these or you will encounter these when you're watching weather reports on the news or when you're reading job ads on a website. A teacher could also ask students to think of analogies involving these targeted learning outcomes. For example, asking the students, how is talking about weather like talking about food? How is asking people about their jobs like asking people about their hobbies? Right? Getting students to look for analogies. A teacher could also model listening and reading. For example, by thinking aloud while doing a reading comprehension activity. And a teacher could ask students to look for general patterns in more than just vocabulary, more than just words. For example, asking students to look at a conversation, a reading text, and look for patterns. Look for general patterns in those texts. And there are some differences between the units as well. Four Corners has a relatively broad range for 5 out of the 10 Teaching for Transfer techniques in the evaluation framework. And it also reflects a couple of things not reflected in the network book: anticipating applications and matching in terms of writing skills. On the other hand, the unit in network reflects a broad range of Teaching for Transfer techniques in a much smaller number of pages than the unit in Four Corners. So I think depending on the situation, a teacher could find either one of these appropriate. So to wrap up, there are a few things to keep in mind with this about this evaluation framework and any conclusions that it might lead to about materials. First, as the demonstration showed, looking at just one unit from a textbook can provide worthwhile information. But this is a small sample of a book, let alone a series that might include multiple levels and components, like teacher's guides, workbooks, websites, DVDs, and so on. So it's possible that there are other activities in other parts of the materials that would help fill gaps that we might notice in just one unit. And because of the amount of detail the evaluation framework produces, it might be difficult to apply it to much larger samples of a textbook or materials. So this is a limitation that should be kept in mind when the framework is used. Second, this framework helps us to see how Teaching for Transfer techniques are reflected in materials, which is important because we want to be sure that we and the materials we use are doing as much as possible to promote transfer. But reflecting Teaching for Transfer techniques does not necessarily mean promoting actual transfer. Transfer is complex and is influenced not only by teaching and materials in learning situations, but also by factors that ESOL teachers have less control over, like students' motivation to transfer and the support that students receive for transfer outside the ESOL classroom. So ideally, there will be some research to see if materials that reflect these Teaching for Transfer techniques actually do promote learning transfer. If so, we might also ask if materials that incorporate more techniques or particular techniques or combinations of techniques are more effective than others. We might also ask if, for a given Teaching for Transfer technique, like simulating or generalizing concepts, if some kinds of activities in the materials are more effective than others for promoting that. These kinds of questions illustrate some productive directions that we could go in to, I think, make the most of this materials evaluation framework. That's all for me. And in terms of the formal part of the presentation, there's a list of references there in case you're interested in digging into this anymore. A lot of useful stuff there. And after the convention, again, I will post a recording of this and the slides on that website, and please feel free to email me. So that's it, and I guess we have 10 minutes for questions, right?
Would you say the two texts that you looked at were saturated?
That's a good question. Saturation is going to be a relative idea, right? Because any two books, you can say that one is going to be more saturated than another. But then compared to some other books, they might be less saturated. So compared to, I demonstrated today 2 books. When I was putting all this together over about the last year, I've been working on this topic, doing research on this topic for about 10 years, but I've been trying to work towards a practical evaluation framework for about the last year. And I looked at a collection of about 20 books just to see how these Teaching for Transfer techniques appear in these books. And I think these 2 are fairly consistent with what I saw across 20 of currently available commercial textbooks from mainstream publishers: Cambridge, Oxford, Pearson, Macmillan, and National Geographic Cengage. So they're consistent with what I've seen with other books. Are they saturated? I think we could do more. There's a lot of stuff reflected in these books. And I think it goes back to that point I said earlier that has stuck with me in one of the early articles about teaching for transfer that I have found very useful. It was written in 1988, and it's on this list. Perkins and Salomon, 1988. They discussed this idea of bridging and hugging being two general techniques for teaching for transfer. They weren't talking about materials. They weren't talking about TESOL. They were talking about education in general. And they suggested that if we want to teach for transfer, we need to make our teaching contexts similar to the context we hope transfer will occur to, so that students just get used to it and it becomes like routine for them. It becomes kind of automatic. But we also want to teach so that students are regularly trying to think in general ways about what it is that they're learning. Trying to take examples and try to think of general principles and concepts, general rules, because that's supposed to be a more sort of transferable way of learning.
You know, this is all married to the Common Core standards, right?
Are you seeing connections? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly. The Common Core is talking about authentic situation.
Yeah.
It's talking about all of that.
Yeah.
It's exactly there.
That's interesting, right? And I think one point that those two researchers made that maybe is relevant still 20 years later is that these are not new techniques. These teaching for transfer techniques are not new. We can see them in our own teaching and on colleagues' teaching in lots of contexts. But it goes back to your question about saturation. The idea that if we want to take transfer seriously, we shouldn't be letting it using these things inconsistently and assuming that it's going to happen. They had a nice way to remember that. They talked about the Bo Peep theory of transfer, which is if like the little nursery rhyme, right? The little Bo Peep has the sheep, and if you just leave them alone, they'll come home. The Bo Peep theory of transfer is what is common, I think, I've seen this as well, in a lot of education contexts, that as teachers we think that if the students are demonstrating learning in our classroom, when they leave, of course they're going to transfer. They're going to take those things and use them. But a lot of research suggests that's not the case. So yeah, if we can do the things that we're already doing, that are reflected in this kind of a framework, but do them persistently, consistently, systematically, looking at whatever it is we want students to learn, whatever those target outcomes are, and thinking, are we getting students to use those target learning outcomes in activities that hug and bridge to target contexts? So yeah, I think that's the sort of bottom line here. It's not new in terms of the content, but the idea of thinking about it in terms of saturation and systematicity, I think, is something that is not being done in a lot of contexts. So I don't know what's happening with the Common Core. That'll be interesting to see if this becomes this kind of way of looking at materials and teaching becomes more systematic.
I think the biggest difference is instead of just taking a character of something you read, you would really read a piece that was an original piece, and then you would interview them. It might be like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or something. That might be a little difficult, but something like that, and then you would interview them like they were Lincoln.
I see.
Why did you say this in here?
I see. Interesting. Yeah. And I saw a similar activity in one of the books. It was reading a short, what looked like a magazine article about a guy who works on an oil rig. And it was just describing his job. This is, I think his name is Eduardo or something. This is Eduardo, and this is what he does, blah, blah, blah. And there's, half a page of information about him. And then, we now work in pairs. One of you is Eduardo. The other one is going to interview Eduardo and just find out more information about his job. Which I think fits into that category of simulation. It's not getting students to think about a specific situation outside the class, but it is getting them to project into situations that aren't in the class. I mean, here I am talking to Lincoln or talking to Eduardo. I mean, these people aren't here, so I'm pretending to be somewhere else. Hopefully. Please.
I have a question about one of your questions in the framework.
Okay. Yeah.
The one about looking for general principles or patterns
Yep.
beyond English use.
Yeah.
Would that include maybe having a little hard time figuring out what that would involve? But
Yeah.
maybe comparing languages between English and their L1s, maybe, or
What that makes me think more of is the next one about analogizing, actually. because if you're looking for similarities, the idea is that by making connections, something new that I've learned, if I can connect it to something I already know or I know a little bit better, it's going to make it a little bit easier for me to take that and apply it in other situations because I already know how to do this other thing and I use that in other situations. So,
What would be an example of a pattern?
of this. So going back, sorry, to the because your question was about the general rules or patterns. Yeah, maybe a simpler way of looking at this is that this is about inductive. We talk about teaching grammar deductively and inductively, like giving the students the rule, a grammar rule, and then saying, okay, here's a bunch of examples, or now you produce a bunch of examples. This is the other way of doing things, inductive, right? Giving students a bunch of examples. Here's a bunch of sentences. I want you to look at them and tell me what you see that's similar across these sentences. What do you notice about the order of the subject and the verb? Oh, okay, so now the students are coming up with the rule themselves. That's exactly what this is. Now, that example applies to grammar, but I think we can take any of the things that we're trying to teach in a language class and say, is there something we can get the students to generalize? Get them to think themselves about what is the pattern behind this or the principle. What's the big idea? It's a grammar rule. It's the meaning of a word. It's a strategy that I can use to read, something like that.
So this is more along the lines of students in the concept of noticing. It's not we're telling them explicitly. It's they're having to go and figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, and I should point out, there are different ways to do all of these things, and that's an important point in relation to this one because. One of these sources that I read, in fact, I think it was that Perkins and Salomon 1988 one that I think is a really good read on this topic. And they said for this topic, for this technique, generalizing, getting students to generalize concepts, they said that a teacher can do this by offering the general rule themselves, but that it's better if you can get students to do it. If you can get students to notice themselves what those general patterns and general rules are. So. Again, I think it's a complicated topic, and we do need more research to sort some of this stuff out. Like, is it how much more effective is it if we ask students to come up with the rule themselves rather than giving it to them? Because in some situations, it's certainly effective and efficient to give students a rule, a general rule, and have them look at some examples. According to this framework, it wouldn't be the best way to stimulate transfer, but it might. But I'm sure it can still lead to transfer. But we want to tease that out with a little bit of research, I think.
I can't see doing this with, and I'm sorry I'm talking so much. I'm really
It's okay.
interested in what you're saying.
It's okay.
I can't see doing this without some blended learning.
Mm-hmm.
And our program is paperless,
Yeah.
so we don't buy textbooks. Everything that we do is on iPads and computers and Kindles and all of that kind of thing. But I do want to tell you there's an excellent website. And I looked it up to be sure I was spelling his name right. It's Larry Ferlazzo.
Yeah.
I don't know if some of you all used him or not. Oh, wow. Everything you're saying here
Really?
just blends right. Because he will say, it's there's fighting going on in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And then he comes up with lesson plans that go along with about the Crimean, about what's going on in Ukraine. But it's for everything's for ESL.
Yeah.
But we use him constantly.
Yeah.
But just because he has lots of lesson plans, lots of interesting things to do that are very authentic.
Yeah.
Almost everything he does is authentic. Would you agree?
And that's an important part of those, especially the first set of 5 techniques. This idea of hugging, trying to hug those target contexts. Authenticity is a big part of that. So.
Honestly, that's one of the reasons we went paperless is because we have guidelines and we have standards, don't get me wrong. But it was so that we could really deal with authenticity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, how do you spell it?
Yeah, okay,
Ferlazzo?
Oh, it is Larry, Ferlazzo. And he will send you, if you sign up with him, you'll get emails daily.
L-A or L-E?
Lazzo.
Thank you. Great.
I know I have a little accent. Just look up Larry Ferlazzo, and then just Google it, and you'll be able to get his website. I don't think. Let me see if I have it here.
That's fair.
Yeah, it's really edublogs.org. So it's easier just to look him up.
Great, thank you. I think just one last question, then we'll clear
And
up.
I don't even know him.
I always use those disclaimers too. I know.
Have you used this for like a department-wide curriculum review?
No.
Just like-
No, and this is the kind of thing, I want to keep working with this and make it as efficient, easy to use as possible. So I've been working with it and trying it myself because this is the goal for me is to try to create something that we will use for in different real school settings and departments.
Curriculum review with my low advanced level teachers this
Yeah.
summer, so I'd like to include some of this.
Oh, you know what? Please, I hope that if you have an opportunity and you're interested, please do, and please let me know how it goes because I'd like to make something as practical and usable as possible.
I'd like to do it too. We did a more like just general evaluation of our curriculum this last term, and I'd like to do it again, a second round, but with a more focused purpose
I
behind
see.
it.
Yeah.
And this teaching to transfer, I think, makes a lot of sense. And I'm also curious how you think now for a while now, a lot of the publishers are using corpus-based research to create their materials.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if this teaching to transfer could also be facilitated by telling students how their textbooks have been developed and using frequency. Explaining when I teach students about the AWL, they're like, oh,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Great. Right.
Yeah, we've got technology that what I'm showing you is based on research that says this is frequent and you're going to run into this.
It's like real, and they can see and they start making those connections. I agree. I think so.
And
Yeah.
the cognition that you were talking about before, I think, could be useful in even just explaining to the learners how their textbook was created.
Yes. Yeah.
And for what intention is behind it.
And like why exactly? Why was it created that way? Because that's doing step number one in this list is setting expectations, making it explicit to students that we want to see transfer happening. Our materials should say that somewhere. We should be saying it somewhere. We expect transfer. We're not just teaching so that you forget stuff when you leave the room.
It's almost surprising that the textbooks aren't more explicit about how they were constructed for students.
Mm-hmm.
Like when publishers are telling us about them, they tell us that. But
Right.
that with adult learners in particular, why aren't they teaching the learners?
Tell the learners.
About the study behind the book?
Well, they're the ones who have to do the transfer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a good question. They're the ones who have to do the transfer, not the teachers. Thanks, everyone. I know there's probably another one coming. Thank you. Please feel free to visit or look at this stuff online.
And it's going to be there Monday?
In the next couple of days, yeah.
Okay.
As soon as I get back to Arizona.